Well, welcome back. Friday, February 21st, 2020. At the end of the show yesterday, a few things came to mind. Some showing how fast things move, some revealing how easily we are sucked into what we call the frenzy here. You know, the Democratic Party, left, cable, social media whirlwind and maelstrom that they like to keep us in. The constant state of crisis. And how all of it takes our minds, never mind our souls, off the durables, the permanent, and what should be the calm and the steady. Item. Do you realize it was just still this month the Senate voted on impeaching the President of the United States? In a short month. It is a short month, obviously, and we're not done with it. But do you realize that all still took place this month? Note how failed that frenzy was at the permanent, or at least the long-lasting. Nancy Pelosi paraded the idea, still parades the idea around, that the president would be impeached forever. Impeachment is forever, she keeps saying. Yup. But so too is acquittal. And now let's discuss for a second how right we are and how wrong she was. Not a single peep about the president being impeached was made at the Democratic Party debates on Wednesday. Not a peep. Wasn't talked about. It wasn't brought up. Does that not tell you a few things? Namely, Pelosi was just wrong. Adam Schiff was just wrong. Jerry Nadler was just wrong. Chuck Schumer was just wrong. It was all nothing close to the heights they summoned their rhetoric and warnings to and about. If it were important, meaningful, striking to the American people, those running for president would certainly avail themselves of talking about it. They're playing for the Super Bowl, clearly, but it's not a play they want, not this impeachment thing. They might as well be saying what Pelosi and Schumer orchestrated was not their monkey and not their circus, because it wasn't the American people's monkey or the American people's circus. Item. William Barr should resign or be impeached for interfering in the sentencing of Roger Stone. Roger Stone was given 3.5 years in prison for lying to Congress. My God, were it not for the speech and debate clause, almost every member of Congress would be given jail time for lying. Related item. It looks like just now Ilhan Omar's past has finally caught up to her. She'd be candidate one for such condign punishment. Note how she continually deflects the charges of immigration and civil court violations. Anyone who alleges them is a bigot or a Zionist. That's the latest she's promoting. All praise to Scott Johnson and the Powerline blog for not letting this story go. They took the scalp of Dan Rather. I think they'll end up taking this one too. It just takes a little longer these days, because of the shield provided by charges of Islamophobia. These shields do work, but only for a time. Just ask Jussie Smollett. But then after thinking about these things, the durables came rolling back to me, like the discovery we made on air yesterday. Something, for all my talking about the underlying issue, I did not realize. Only 15% of those under the age of 30 think the U.S. is the greatest nation on earth. Think about that for our long term. Think about what the under 30 crowd not only thinks of the United States, but what they must think of other places to think about the United States at such a low level. Think about how we invoked Lincoln and Reagan, and when we do, we invoke them talking about this being the last best hope of man or the last best hope of man on earth. Think about how that has simply no resonance or meaning to 85% of those under 30. I go back to what Leszek Kolakowski said, quote, "We learn history not in order to know how to behave or how to succeed, but to know who we are." We don't learn history. We are taught bad and wrong history, and thus, surprise, we don't know who we are anymore. This has never happened before. Here's how historian David McCulloch put it. Quote, "If we raise generation after generation of young Americans who are historically illiterate, we are running a terrible risk for this country. You could have amnesia of a society which is as detrimental as amnesia of an individual. And of course, if people begin to think that all that we have, all the blessings, our freedoms, our art, our music, our literature, our great institutions, the faith, the creed we have that has held us together for 229 years in equality, and the idea that all men are created equal, the ideal of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if all that seems to be something that just fell out of the sky, that it is just part of the natural world and that nobody struggled for it, that there's no story behind it, then we are really, in my view, in the soup. Jefferson said it perfectly well. He said, any nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never can be. Our very freedoms depend on education, and that is why education has been a sustaining thing, one of the great guidelines all throughout our history, from the time of our founders to the present. Now, this takes us to, one of my favorite, because most haunting quotes. Another Eastern European who saw his country disappear, Milan Kundera. In his book on Laughter and Forgetting, he wrote this, quote, "The first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books, its culture, its history, then have somebody write new books, manufacture a new culture, invent a new history. Before long, the nation will begin to forget what it is and what it was. The world around it will forget even faster," close quote. Which brings me to the two-step process we now find ourselves in. First, make our history dull or boring, then reinvent it to make it bad. And I give you exactly what has transpired from knowing that 77 years before 1863, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, to a new memory, a new history, a new culture, that it wasn't 1776, as we all know, until about yesterday, but now it's actually 1619. Because slavery, as the New York Times 1619 Project has it, was not an anomaly or a mistake, something we had to compromise on while putting it on the course of ultimate extinction, but rather a defining narrative and characteristic that we still live with, even now, 75 years after eliminating it. More time since we've liberated ourselves from it than there was between our founding and Lincoln rededicating us to our commitment to eliminating it. Think about that. Thank God, and I mean that, thank God, a serious group of black Americans, African Americans, has stood up to resist this and try to drag us back to what Lincoln knew, to what, as they say, we all knew up until about yesterday. They started what's called the 1776 Project. It won't get attention in the New York Times because it counters the New York Times, but it deserves it, and it will get it here. One of its members, Professor Wilfred Reilly, wrote this about it, quote, "Three core elements of my view of slavery, and I think it is fair to say 1776 view as well. They are, one, recognizing that an anti-slavery movement led by white and black people of goodwill existed in this country as long as slavery did, and it won in the end. Two, recognizing that slavery did not build the USA, but rather made the pre-bellum South into something of a backwater, due largely to the proud, if subtle, resistance of the slaves themselves. And three, recognizing that America paid a diverse butcher's bill of hundreds of thousands of lives during the Civil War in order to free the slaves. A rock-ribbed anti-slavery movement dates back almost literally to the American founding. As early as the 1770s, black New Englanders, thousands of whom were Revolutionary War veterans, began a petition-writing campaign that targeted northern state legislatures and demanded an end to slavery. These petitions essentially worked. By the 1790s, 10 states and territories, containing more than 50% of the free population of the new nation, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, the Northwest Territory, and the Indiana Territory, they were free land by law. And the anti-slavery upswell continued. In 1794, Congress prohibited any participation by American ships in the Atlantic slave trade. In 1808, the act prohibiting importation of slaves made any shipment of enslaved persons from abroad into the USA a crime. Finally, in 1865, all slavery was declared illegal at the constitutional level in the United States. And since that last milestone, some 155 years ago, it is worth noting that the population of the country has grown 874%, and our GDP has increased 11,796%, with both increases driven largely by modern-era foreign immigration. There's a lot more to say here, but God bless this movement and Professor Reilly. Who would have thought, in a generation that has known great American history and historians, from Samuel Eliot Morison to David McCullough, from Henry Commager to Daniel Boorstin, all Democrats, by the way, that we would need to reclaim their work, to do nothing more than restore the understanding and knowledge we used to have. But that, after all, I guess, is our task. As Plato put it in a fetching pitch at the end of one of his plays, all learning is that which we used to know. Here's how Hadley Arcus wrote it, and I conclude with a quote from him. We are reminded then that the permanent things will not always be seen. That is precisely the function of teaching and statesmanship, to bring all of us back to what Ronald Reagan sought to do. So we find ourselves backing our way into the lessons of Plato's Meno, that so much of our knowledge is already tucked away within us. And it becomes a matter then of drawing out the things we come to feel that we have known all along. The genius of statecraft as teaching is that it reminds us of the things we used to know. And when it is done rightly, we realize they are things we actually never forgot in the first place. I'm Seth Leibsohn. 602-508-0960 is our number. We'll be right back. I'd like to take a moment to tell you about my friends at Guns Etc. They are true American patriots. They strongly support our president, and they have over 10,200 square feet of firearms and firearm accessories. Please take my advice and stop by their store, which is a symbol of American freedom, or visit them at gunsetcetera.com and have access to over $350 million in firearms merchandise.